They told us the desert was empty. They lied. The desert is full. It is full of time. It is full of a silence so heavy it crushes your ribs just as surely as a collapsing trench. And it is full of eyes. The sun, that great unblinking hateful eye of a God who has decided that you, specifically you, are an offense to the purity of the sand. I am not writing this for the fatherland. I am not writing this for history. I am writing this to prove that I existed before the wind scrubs my footprints from the earth. It began with a sound that wasn't a sound. It was a physical pressure, a high-pitched needle drilling into the center of my skull. Eeeeee. A single, unending note, like a violin string pulled until it snaps, but it never snaps. I was face down. My mouth was open. The first distinct sensation was not pain, but texture, grit. It coated my tongue, dry, abrasive, inorganic. I tried to spit, but my mouth was a kiln. There was no moisture to gather, only a thick metallic paste of dust and dried blood. I ground my teeth together, and the sound reverberated through my jawbone like a stone crushing a beetle. Crunch. I didn't move. I couldn't. My body felt distant, a heavy sack of wet wool that someone else had left in the sun. Slowly, other senses began to claw their way back through the concussion. The smell hit me next. It was the smell of Tunisia in the spring of '43. It smelled of ancient baked rocks, of sagebrush that had given up the ghost, and the sharp chemical sting of cordite. But underneath that, the sweet cloying scent of something organic beginning to spoil in the heat. My right hand was numb. I sent a command to the fingers. Move. Nothing. I tried again, focusing all my will on the index finger. Twitch. It moved. It scraped against something hot. I pushed. The effort cost me everything. I levered my chest off the ground, the muscles in my back screaming in protest, trembling violently. The world tilted, spun, and then slammed back into focus. I was in a depression, a shallow bowl of scree and sand, surrounded by jagged rocks that looked like broken teeth. The sun was directly overhead. It wasn't just light. It was weight. It pressed down on the back of my neck, burning through the fabric of my tunic. The tropical olive cotton, now bleached to a sickly bone white by months of exposure, offered no protection. The heat felt malicious. It felt personal. I looked at my hands. They were gray, covered in a fine powder of ash and sand. The cuticles were cracked, filled with black grime. My wristwatch, a simple silvery thing my father had given me in Hamburg, was shattered. The hands were frozen at 09:14. Time had stopped. "Hannes?" I croaked. The voice didn't sound like mine. It sounded like dry leaves rubbing together. "Hannes?" I turned my head to the left. The movement made the horizon swim with nausea. 3 meters away lay a shape. It was a mound of field gray uniform, indistinguishable from the rocks except for the geometric unnaturalness of the webbing straps. A helmet, a Stahlhelm painted that mustard yellow desert camouflage, lay upside down next to it, rocking slightly in the hot breeze. I crawled toward the shape. The sand burned my palms. The knees of my trousers were worn thin, and I could feel the sharp edges of the flint beneath. It was Hannes, or it had been. He was lying on his back. His eyes were open, staring up at that terrible blue sky, already clouded with the milky film of the dead. His mouth was slightly agape, as if he were about to complain about the rations, about the old man's canned beef, about the lack of letters from home. But there was a small, neat hole in his throat. A dark, almost black crust had formed down the side of his tunic, stiffening the fabric. I sat back on my heels. The nausea returned, a wave of bile rising in my throat. I swallowed it down. It tasted of acid. I reached out and touched his shoulder. The wool was hot from the sun, but the body underneath was already cooling, the life leaking out into the thirsty sand. I looked at his bread bag. It was torn open, empty. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced the heat haze. My hands flew to my own belt. I fumbled with the leather straps, my fingers shaking so badly I could barely grip the buckles. The canteen, the Feldflash. I unclipped it. It felt terrifyingly light. The felt cover, designed to be soaked in water to keep the contents cool, was bone dry. It felt like rough sandpaper against my skin. I unscrewed the aluminum cap with trembling fingers. I shook it. Slosh. A sound. A beautiful, wet sound, but small. too small. I peered inside, less than a mouthful, perhaps 2 swallows of warm, stale water. I capped it immediately, screwing it shut with a tightness that made my wrist ache. I looked around wildly now. Where was the unit? Where were the trucks? The Opel Blitz supply wagons? The half-tracks? The valley was empty. The battle had happened. When? An hour ago? Yesterday? The shattered watch offered no answers. The tracks in the sand near the ridge were already softening, the wind erasing the history of our retreat. I stood up. My legs felt like they were filled with lead shot. I braced myself against a large boulder. The stone was hot enough to cook an egg. I pulled my Mauser Car 98K from where it had fallen. The wood of the stock was smooth, polished by the sweat of my hands over 2 years of war. I cycled the bolt, clack, clack. A round ejected and spun into the sand, bright brass catching the sun. I picked it up, wiped the dust off it with my thumb, and pressed it back into the magazine. The spring was stiff. 5 rounds. I had 2 more stripper clips in my pouch. 15 bullets. 15 bullets to kill. What? The sun? The wind? I climbed the lip of the depression, my boots sliding in the loose shale. The sound of my own breathing was deafening, ragged, gasping rasps that scraped my throat raw. I reached the top and looked out. To the north, a haze of dust hung in the air, miles away. That was the retreat. They were gone. The engines of the Afrika Korps were fading ghosts. To the south and west, the great eastern erg stretched out, an ocean of dunes, rising and falling like petrified waves. Heat shimmer distorted the horizon, making the mountains dance and liquefy. There was nothing. No motion, no birds, no engines, no shouting, just the wind. It hissed through the dry scrub, a sound like a snake moving over paper. Shh, I was alone. The realization didn't hit me like a blow. It soaked into me, slow and cold, like freezing water rising in a sinking ship. I was a speck of biological matter on a continent of stone and fire. I looked down at Hannes one last time. I should bury him. That is what a soldier does. That is what a human does. I took a step toward him, and the world went white at the edges. I swayed. My body knew what my mind refused to accept. Digging a grave in this heat with 2 swallows of water was a death sentence. To spend the sweat was to spend my lifeblood. "Forgive me, Hannes," I whispered. My voice cracked. I turned my back on him. I turned my back on the dead. I adjusted the strap of my rifle, feeling the familiar bruising weight settle on my shoulder. I checked my compass, an old Bakelite marching compass. The needle swung lazily, then settled. North. North was safety. North was the sea. North was the unit. But between me and the north lay the open killing ground, the flat pans where the British hurricanes hunted anything that moved. I looked east, toward the jagged ridges of the Matmata Hills. There would be shade there, shadows. I took the first step. The boot crunched into the crust of the desert. The sound was incredibly loud in the silence. Crunch, 1 step, crunch, 2 steps. The sun beat down on my helmet, turning the air inside into a convection oven. My brain felt like it was swelling, pressing against the bone. I started to walk, not with the disciplined march of the Wehrmacht, but with the shambling, desperate gait of an animal that knows it is being hunted by the sky itself. The silence followed me. It watched. It waited. Here is Chapter 2. Chapter 2, The Geometry of Pain. 1, 2, 3, 4. The math of survival is simple. It is a binary code of movement, left foot, right foot. If the sequence stops, the system fails. If the system fails, the biological matter decays. I walked. The concept of distance had lost its meaning. There was no kilometers, no meters. There was only the immediate 3 feet of ground in front of my boots. I studied it with the obsession of a jeweler examining a flaw in a diamond. The ground here was not sand. It was hamada, a hard, flat pavement of swept stone, dark and polished by eons of wind. It reflected the heat upward, so I was roasting on a spit, the sun pressing down from above, the black stones radiating up from below. My boots, standard-issue jack boots, felt like iron casts. With every step, I could feel the leather bite into the raw flesh of my heels. A blister had formed on my left small toe, a bubble of fluid trapped against the stiff leather. I felt it burst around the 1,000th step, a sharp, hot needle of pain. Then, the dull throb of friction. I welcomed it. The pain was a tether. It meant my nerves were still firing. It meant I was not yet a ghost. The sun moved, or perhaps the earth turned. It happened with agonizing slowness. The silence of the desert is not empty. It is heavy. It presses against the eardrums. My own heartbeat became a roar, a hydraulic thumping in my temples. Thump, hiss, the sound of blood trying to push through veins that had narrowed, hoarding their moisture. I stopped. I didn't decide to stop. My legs simply ceased to receive orders. I swayed, the heavy Mauser rifle swinging on its strap, cracking against my hip bone. I looked up. The Matmata hills were closer, but they looked like a jagged painting, two-dimensional and wavering in the heat haze. The air between me and the rocks was liquid. It danced. I licked my lips. The skin split. A tiny bead of blood welled up. I tasted it. Iron. Salt. Drink, the lizard brain whispered. Drink now. My hand drifted to the canteen. The aluminum was hot to the touch. I caressed the felt cover. It was a sensual, terrifying intimacy. I could drink it all, right now. I could unscrew that cap and pour the tepid, stale water down my throat, and for 10 seconds, I would be a king. I would be a god. And then, by sunset, I would be dead. I pulled my hand away as if the metal had burned me. Not yet, I rasped. The words were soundless puffs of air. I looked at my shadow. It was a small, black puddle directly beneath my boots. Midday, the killing time. I needed to move. To stand still was to bake. But the weight of my gear was becoming an impossible physics equation. The webbing, the ammunition pouches, leather stiff and cracking. The gas mask canister, a useless metal cylinder rattling against my lower back. We hadn't seen gas since the Great War, yet we carried the masks like talismans. I unhooked the strap of the canister. The metal clanked against the rifle stock. I looked at it. A cylinder of green-painted steel. Inside was a rubber mask that smelled of fear and industrial talc. I let it drop. It hit the stones with a clang that sounded shockingly loud, a desecration of the silence. It rolled once, then settled. I felt lighter, perhaps 2 kilograms lighter. But the psychological weight lifted was immense. I had just discarded a piece of the Wehrmacht. I had discarded a regulation. I was becoming less of a soldat and more of a creature. I took a step away from it, then another. I didn't look back. The terrain began to rise. The flat hamada gave way to broken scree, sharp flints that slid and clattered under my hobnails. The slope was gentle, but in this heat, it felt like climbing a vertical wall. My breath came in short, jagged gasps. The air was too hot to provide oxygen. It felt like inhaling from an open oven door. I focused on a single rock about 50 meters up the slope, a large, fractured boulder that cast a sliver of shadow. Get to the rock, I told myself, just to the rock. I marched. My vision began to tunnel. The periphery turned gray, dissolving into static. The world narrowed down to the toes of my boots in the gray stone ahead. Crunch, slide, breath, crunch. I stumbled. My knee hit a jagged flint. I didn't feel it. I scrambled up, using the rifle as a crutch, ignoring the way the hot wood burned my palm. I reached the boulder. I collapsed into the shadow. It wasn't cool. It was merely less hot. The temperature dropped perhaps 5 degrees, from fatal to unbearable. I pressed my back against the stone. It was rough, abrasive, but solid. I closed my eyes. The darkness behind my eyelids was filled with flashing red lights, the firing of dying neurons. I reached for the canteen. My hands were shaking so violently that I couldn't grip the cap. I had to use both hands, clamping them together like a vice. Screech! The threads protested. I lifted the flask. The smell of the water hit me, warm, metallic, smelling faintly of the aluminum container. It was the most beautiful scent in the world. I took a sip. I forced myself to hold the liquid in my mouth. It was warm, almost hot. I let it wash over my tongue, let it soak into the cracked mucous membranes. My cheeks stung. My throat spasmed, begging to swallow. I swallowed. The sensation was electric. I could feel the water traveling down my esophagus, a physical track of moisture moving into the core of my body. My stomach contracted, cramping slightly at the sudden intrusion. I wanted more. The urge to upend the flask was a physical lust, stronger than any desire I had ever felt for a woman, stronger than any hunger. I screwed the cap back on. I screwed it on until my knuckles turned white. "That is all," I whispered to the empty air. "That is all you get." I checked the time. My watch was still dead, broken at 09:14. Time was irrelevant. Only the sun mattered. I looked out from my shadow. The desert floor stretched out below me, a vast, shimmering copper pan. And there, a tiny black dot in the middle of the desolation, was the gas mask canister, a small punctuation mark in a sentence written by the devil. I closed my eyes again. I needed to sleep, but sleep was dangerous. Sleep in the heat meant dehydration. I had to wait for the sun to lose its anger. I sat there for hours. I watched the shadows lengthen. I watched the color of the sand shift from blinding white to ochre, then to a deep bruised purple. The silence changed. The hissing wind died down. The absolute stillness of the evening set in. It was a silence so profound, it felt like the earth was holding its breath. Then, the temperature broke. It didn't cool down gradually. It plummeted. As the sun dipped below the jagged horizon of the west, the heat vanished as if a door had been opened. The sweat on my uniform, soaked into the heavy wool, suddenly turned clammy. Cold. I shivered, a violent full-body tremor that rattled my teeth. I opened my eyes. The sky was darkening into a deep indigo. The first star appeared, Venus, bright and mocking. I had survived the day. But now the desert was changing its weapon. It was trading the oven for the freezer. The uniform that had been suffocating me was now the only thing keeping the warmth in my blood. I stood up. My joints were stiff, glued together by fatigue. I looked up at the hills. The silhouette of the ridge was sharp against the darkening sky. There would be caves there, or at least a windbreak. I had to climb, in the dark. I adjusted the rifle. It felt heavier now, a lead weight. I took a step. The boot crunched loudly in the new, cold silence. 1, I counted. I began to climb into the night. Here is Chapter 3. Chapter 3. The teeth of the night darkness did not fall. It rose. It welled up from the ravines and the cracks in the earth, swallowing the ankles, then the knees, then the mind. By the time the last bruise of purple light faded from the western horizon, I was effectively blind. The desert night is not the darkness of a cellar or a closet. It is a vast, expansive void. The stars above, millions of them hard and cold as diamond chips, offered no illumination. They simply highlighted the absolute blackness of the ground beneath my feet. The cold was a physical assault. In the span of an hour, the temperature had dropped 30 degrees. My uniform, the tropical cotton tunic that had been soaked with sweat all afternoon, was now a sheet of ice against my skin. The moisture froze in the fabric, turning it into a stiff, abrasive shell. I stopped climbing. I had to. My shins had struck a boulder I hadn't seen, and the pain shot up my leg, sickening and sharp. I stood there, swaying, listening to the chatter of my own teeth. Click, 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 click. It was an involuntary, rhythmic spasm that shook my skull. I tried to clench my jaw, but the muscles refused to obey. The cold had bypassed my skin and settled into the marrow. I needed the Celtbon. My fingers, numb and clumsy, fumbled at the back of my belt. The shelter quarter, a triangular piece of camouflage canvas, was rolled tight. It took an eternity to undo the straps. My fingers felt like sausages, lacking sensation at the tips. I clawed at the buckles, cursing softly. "Come on," I whispered. The words were visible puffs of white steam that vanished instantly. Finally, the canvas unrolled. It was stiff with cold. I didn't set it up as a tent. There were no poles, no pegs, and the ground was stone. Instead, I wrapped it around my shoulders like a grand, pathetic cape. It smelled of old rain and warehouse dust. It offered a thin layer of wind protection, but no warmth. The only warmth in the universe was the fading ember of my own metabolism. I continued the ascent. Navigation was now entirely tactile. I reached out with my left hand, groping the air until I found stone, rough limestone, pockmarked and sharp. I used it to guide me. Step, slide, grip. The silence of the day had been heavy, but the silence of the night was alive. The cooling rocks ticked and popped, sharp pistol crack sounds that made me flinch, my thumb instinctively finding the safety catch of the Mauser. Crack. I froze. Was that a rock or a boot? I held my breath. The blood roared in my ears, a whoosh-whoosh sound that mimicked the rhythm of footsteps. I turned slowly, peering back into the abyss of the valley floor. Nothing. Just the velvet black. But my mind began to populate the darkness. I saw shapes that weren't there. A darker patch of shadow became a British commando, knife raised. A trick of the starlight on a quartz vein became the glint of a sniper scope. I was hallucinating. The dehydration was beginning to curdle my perception. "Pull yourself together, Elias," I muttered. The sound of my name was strange. It belonged to a man in Hamburg, a man who drank coffee and read newspapers. It didn't belong to this shivering creature on a rock face. I climbed for another hour, or perhaps 2. Time was measured only in shivering fits. Then, the ground leveled out. The wind picked up, howling through the jagged peaks with a sound like a flute played by a madman. It cut through the seltbahn, through the tunic, through the skin. I needed a hole, a burrow. I moved along the cliff face, running my hand along the stone wall. Texture, rough, smooth, gap. My hand fell into a void, a fissure. I stopped. I reached in. The air inside felt still, stagnant. It smelled of dry earth and ancient animal droppings. A hyena den? A jackal's lair? I didn't care. If a beast was inside, I would kill it and sleep on its fur. I squeezed through the opening. It was narrow, catching on my webbing, scraping the buttons of my tunic. I pushed, grunting, until the pressure released and I tumbled forward into a small cavern. The wind stopped. The silence here was absolute. Dead. I was on my hands and knees. The floor was covered in soft, powdery dust, aeons of pulverized rock. It felt like velvet under my raw palms. I needed to see. I sat back on my heels and fumbled for my pocket. The matchbox. A simple wooden box with a picture of a ship on it. I shook it. A rattle, half full. I took out a single match. The wood felt fragile. If I snapped it, I struck it against the side of the box. Psst! A flare of yellow light. The sudden brightness was blinding. I squinted, tears streaming from my eyes. The shadows leaped up the walls, dancing wildly. The cave was small, perhaps 3 meters deep and 1 meter high. The ceiling was low, heavy rock that seemed ready to crush me. The floor was empty, save for a few white fragments in the corner. I crawled toward them, holding the match high. The flame was eating down the wood, nearing my fingers. Bones. Small bones. A rib cage the size of a fist. A skull the size of a walnut. A rodent, dead for years, picked clean by ants. The flame burned my finger. I dropped the match. Darkness slammed back into place, heavier than before. The afterimage of the flame burned purple in my vision. I was alone with the bones. I crawled to the back of the cave, as far from the wind as I could get. I curled up into a ball, pulling the seltbahn tight around me, tucking my head into my chest to conserve heat. My knees pressed against my chin. The fetal position. The position of the unborn. My stomach cramped, a sharp, twisting knot of hunger. I ignored it. Hunger was a luxury. Thirst was the master. I closed my eyes. The cold seeped up from the stone floor, stealing the heat from my hip and shoulder. I had to rotate every few minutes to keep the blood flowing. "Sleep," I commanded, but the mind refused. It drifted. I was back in the barracks in Tripoli. The smell of cheap tobacco and frying onions. Hannes was there, polishing his boots. He was laughing. "Elias, look at this. A letter from Greta. She says it's raining in Berlin. Raining. Can you imagine?" I jerked awake. My heart was hammering. "Hannes?" I whispered into the dark. The echo came back, flat and dead. Hannes. He was out there, in the valley, alone. The cold would be freezing the blood in his veins, turning him stiff. The jackals would come soon. They would smell the iron. Guilt is a cold thing. It is colder than the desert night. It sat in my chest, a heavy stone of ice. I had left him. I had left him to the dark. I shivered, a violent spasm that made my teeth snap together. I hugged the rifle to my chest. The metal and wood were the only solid things left in the world. "I will survive," I whispered. It was a lie, or a prayer. I couldn't tell the difference. I drifted again. This time, the darkness took me. Not into sleep, but into a gray liminal space where the wind sounded like voices, and the cold was a woman's hand, stroking my face, urging me to stop shivering, to just lie still, to let go. Let go, Elias. It is so much easier to be cold. "No," I grunted. I bit my tongue, hard. The sharp pain flared. I stayed awake. I listened to the wind hunt for me outside the cave. I waited for the sun. The sun I had cursed 6 hours ago. Now I would have traded my soul for a single ray of its fire. The night was not a time, it was a distance, and I had miles to go before the dawn. Here is Chapter 4. Chapter 4. The Resurrection of Thirst. Dawn did not break. It bled. It began as a bruising of the eastern sky, a dull, sickly violet spreading through the black. Inside the cave, the darkness turned to a thick, grainy gray. I opened my eyes. They were gummed shut with mucus and dust, sealing the lids together. I had to pry them apart with my fingers, tearing the dried matter away from the lashes. The pain of waking was total. During the night, my body had curled into a tight defensive knot to hoard warmth. Now, the muscles had set like concrete. As I tried to unspool my legs, a cramp seized my right calf, a hard wooden knot of agony that made me gasp. I couldn't scream. My throat was too dry. I grabbed the muscle, digging my thumbs into the flesh, massaging the knot with frantic, clumsy movements until it released with a dull throb. I lay there for a long time, panting, staring at the ceiling of the cave. It was mere inches from my nose. I could see the individual grains of limestone, the tiny fossilized spirals of ancient sea creatures. They had died here millions of years ago when this hell was an ocean. Now they watched me join them. The sun breached the horizon. It happened fast. One moment, the air was frigid, biting at my exposed nose. The next, a shaft of light, red and angry, shot through the fissure of the cave entrance. It hit the back wall and exploded, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the stagnant air. The heat followed instantly. It wasn't a gradual warming, it was an invasion. The stone walls, which had sucked the heat from me all night, now began to radiate the morning sun's energy inward. The cave turned from a freezer into a kiln. I sat up. My spine cracked, a sound like dry twigs snapping. I looked at my hands. They were trembling, a fine, high-frequency vibration. The skin was translucent, blue-veined, and covered in a map of small cuts and abrasions. I touched my face. My beard stubble felt like wire brush. My lips were swollen, splitting down the center. I ran my tongue over them, sandpaper on parchment. The thirst was no longer a signal, it was a roar. It drowned out every other thought. It wasn't just in my mouth, it was in my blood, thick and sludge-like, struggling to push through the veins. It was a headache behind the eyes that pulsed in time with my heartbeat. Water. I reached for the canteen. It sat on the dust floor, a gray felt-covered object of worship. I picked it up. It was terrifyingly light. I unscrewed the cap. Screech. The sound set my teeth on edge. I didn't drink immediately. I stared into the dark neck of the bottle. I had to discipline the animal inside me. If I drank it all, the animal would be satisfied for an hour. Then, the man would die. One mouthful, I whispered. My voice was a croak, barely audible. I tilted the flask. The water touched my lips. It was lukewarm. It tasted of aluminum and stale swamp. I let a small amount flow into my mouth, just enough to pool under the tongue. I held it there. I closed my eyes and focused entirely on the sensation of wetness. I let the liquid absorb into the tissues. I swirled it over my gums. I tilted my head back and let it trickle down my throat, drop by agonizing drop. It was gone too soon. The memory of the water was more painful than the thirst itself. I capped the flask. I wanted to scream. I wanted to smash the canteen against the wall and lick the drops from the stone. I clipped it back to my belt. The clip made a sharp click, the sound of finality. I crawled toward the light. Pushing myself out of the fissure was a birthing struggle. The webbing caught, the rifle stock scraped. I emerged onto the ledge, squinting against the assault of the morning light. The world had returned to color. The Matmata hills were no longer black silhouettes, but a riot of burnt orange, rust, and jagged gray. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, devoid of clouds. I stood up, dizzy. The horizon tilted to the left, then corrected. I looked down into the valley I had left. It was a vast bowl of heat. Somewhere down there, Hannes was lying. By now the flies would have found him. I turned away, north, Keep going north. I began to walk along the ridge. The terrain was treacherous, loose shale that slid under my boots, threatening to twist an ankle with every step. I had to focus on the ground. Look, step, test, shift weight. My mind began to detach from the misery of the body. It floated away, seeking comfort. It went to Hamburg, to the Ulster Arkaden. I was sitting at a table with a white tablecloth. It was raining, a heavy gray drizzle that soaked the cobblestones, turning them into slick black mirrors. The sound of the rain was a constant soothing hiss, tires on wet pavement. Shh! I could see the droplets hitting the surface of the canal, thousands of concentric circles expanding and vanishing, water falling from the sky, free, endless, wasteful. I remembered the smell of wet wool and roasted coffee. I remembered a waiter pouring a glass of water. He filled it to the brim. Condensation beaded on the glass. He set it down, and a little spilled over the rim, a puddle on the table. He didn't care. He just wiped it away with a cloth. He wiped away life. "Stop it," I hissed. The image shattered. I was back in the furnace. I stumbled. My boot had caught on a root, a gnarly, petrified piece of wood clinging to the rock. I went down hard, slamming onto my hands and knees. The shale cut into my palms. I stayed there for a moment, breathing the dust, and then I saw it. Right in front of my face, half buried in the scree. It was not a root. I brushed the dirt away with a bleeding hand. It was leather, dried, curled, blackened leather, a strap, and attached to it, bleached white by the sun, was a curve of bone, a scapula, a shoulder blade. I froze. I looked further. A few meters away, wedged between two boulders, was a rusted shape. It looked like a rib cage of metal. I crawled toward it. It was a bicycle, or the skeleton of one. The tires were gone, disintegrated. The frame was pitted and flaked with orange rust. The handlebars were twisted, and next to it, more bones, scattered, disarticulated by scavengers, a femur, a shattered pelvis. I stared at the wreckage. This wasn't recent. This wasn't from our battle. The metal was too corroded. The bones were too clean. I reached out and touched the bicycle frame. It was hot. I saw something glinting in the dirt beneath the frame. I dug for it. It was a button, a brass button. I rubbed the grime away with my thumb. An anchor, the symbol of the French colonial troops, or perhaps Italian. It didn't matter. What mattered was the message. Someone had been here before. Someone had come this way, fleeing or lost just like me. And they had stopped here. They had sat down by this bicycle, perhaps waiting for the cool of the evening, perhaps waiting for rescue. And they had never stood up again. I looked at the skull, which had rolled into a crevice. It seemed to be grinning, a rictus of eternal thirst. I felt a cold shiver ripple through me, despite the heat. This was a mirror. This was my future. I scrambled back, pushing myself away from the bones with my heels. "No," I said, "no." I stood up, swaying dangerously. The panic was rising again, a dark tide in my chest. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't look at him. I checked my compass. North. I had to get over the ridge. I had to see what was on the other side. Maybe the sea. Maybe a road. Maybe just more of this infinite oven. I forced my legs to move. I stepped over the rusted bicycle frame. I stepped over the scattered ribs of the unknown soldier. I climbed. The slope steepened. My breath came in ragged, tearing gasps. The air was thinning, or maybe my lungs were failing. Just to the top, I told myself. Just to the crest. I dug my boots into the sliding scree. I used the rifle as a climbing stick, planting the butt into the rock and hauling myself up. 10 meters, 5 meters, 2. I reached the crest. The wind hit me, a blast of hot air from the other side like opening a furnace door. I looked out. My knees buckled. There was no sea. There was no road. There was no green oasis. Stretching out before me was a vast, shimmering salt pan, a white, blinding void that extended to the horizon. It looked like snow, but I knew what it was. It was a chott, a dry salt lake, and in the middle of it, miles away, distorted by the heat haze, was something that made my heart stop. Shapes, geometric shapes, not rocks, trucks, tents, or just the madness of the heat playing tricks on a dying mind. I squinted, trying to force my eyes to focus through the shimmering air. They were black rectangles against the blinding white salt. I laughed, a dry, hacking sound that hurt my chest. Salvation? Or the cruelest joke of the desert? I took a step down toward the white hell. Here is Chapter 5. Chapter 5. The White Anvil. The descent was a fall into a blinding white void. From the ridge, the chott had looked like a frozen lake, a sheet of pristine snow stretching to the edge of the world. It was a cruel optical trick. As my boots left the scree of the hillside and crunched onto the flat, I realized the horror of the surface. It was not smooth. It was a jagged mosaic of salt plates, millions of hexagonal tiles warped by the sun, their edges curled up like peeling skin. I took the first step onto the pan. Crunch. The sound was brittle, like stepping on a floor covered in dried beetles. The crust gave way, and my boot sank 2 inches into a soft gray sludge beneath. The smell rose instantly, a sulphurous, rotten stench of ancient brine and decaying minerals. It was the smell of a dead ocean. I walked. The heat here was different. On the rocks, the heat had come from the sun. Here, on the salt, it came from everywhere. The white surface acted as a massive reflector, bouncing the solar radiation back up into my face. I was walking inside a light bulb. I had to squint until my eyes were mere slits, weeping uncontrollably to flush out the glare. The tears dried instantly on my cheeks, leaving stiff, salty tracks that burned. I fixed my gaze on the black shapes in the distance. They were the only anchor in this sea of light. Are they trucks? My mind wanted them to be trucks. It wanted them to be the Opel Blitz supply columns of the 10th Panzer Division. It wanted them to be full of men who would shout, "Hey, over here!" and hand me a canteen of cold tea. But the desert teaches you to distrust your mind. I walked for an hour, maybe 2. The shapes danced. They floated above the horizon, detached from the ground, shivering in the soup of rising heat. Sometimes they looked like castles, sometimes like giant beetles. The thirst was now a physical entity, a parasite living in my throat. It felt like I had swallowed a handful of razor blades. My tongue was too large for my mouth. It lay heavy and dry, a piece of dead meat. I stopped to drink. I didn't want to. I wanted to save the last mouthful. But my legs had stopped moving. They simply refused to lift the heavy mud-caked boots. I unclipped the canteen. It felt empty. Panic flared, hot and sudden. I shook it near my ear. Slosh. A tiny, pathetic sound. Maybe 2 tablespoons left. I unscrewed the cap. I didn't drink. I just wet my lips. I let a single drop fall onto my tongue. It vanished instantly, absorbed by the parched tissue before I could even taste it. "Please," I whispered. I capped it. I looked at the shapes again. They were closer now. They had stopped floating. They had settled into the ground. They were angular, metal, trucks. A surge of adrenaline, chemical, and sharp, flooded my system. I started to run, or what passed for running, a stumbling, lurching trot, my rifle banging against my hip. "Hello!" I tried to shout. It came out as a hiss. "Help! German soldier here!" I waved my arm. The motion made me dizzy. I got closer. The details began to resolve through the heat haze. There were 3 of them, 3 dark squares. I slowed down. The silence was wrong. If they were trucks, there should be engines, there should be voices, there should be the clatter of mess tins. There was only the wind, hissing over the salt crust. I reached the first shape. It was an Opel Blitz, or the skeleton of one. It had been stripped naked. The tires were gone, leaving the rusted wheel rims sinking into the salt mud. The canvas cover of the bed was missing, exposing the metal ribs like the bones of a whale. The paint had been sand-blasted away on the windward side, revealing the dull gray steel. I walked around to the cab. The door was missing. The glass was gone. I looked inside. The driver was still there. He was not a body. He was a statue. The dry, salty air had mummified him. His skin was tight against the skull, dark brown and leathery. His teeth were bared in a permanent lipless grin. He was wearing the shreds of a tropical tunic. The eagle on the breast pocket faded to a ghost. He was leaning back, his head resting against the rusted metal of the cab, staring up at the sky that had killed him. I stepped back, my boots squelching in the mud. I looked at the other 2 trucks. Same story. Wrecks, scavenged, abandoned. This wasn't a rescue party. This was a graveyard. A convoy that had gotten lost, bogged down in the salt mud, and died of thirst. Maybe weeks ago. Maybe months. I dropped to my knees. The salt crust bit into my skin through the fabric of my trousers. No, I wept. But there were no tears, just dry, racking sobs that shook my chest. No, no, no! I hit the ground with my fist. The salt shattered. I was going to die here. I was going to sit next to this driver and the sun would dry me out and I would become just another brown statue in the white waste. Then, my eye caught something. In the back of the second truck. A gleam. I stopped sobbing. I wiped my eyes with my dirty knuckles. I stood up, swaying, and stumbled to the second truck. I pulled myself up over the tailgate. The metal burned my hands. The bed was empty, mostly, just trash. A torn boot, a crate filled with sand. But in the corner, wedged behind the wheel well, was a canister. A jerry can. It was painted with a white cross, the marking for water. My heart stopped. Then it hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I scrambled toward it, crawling over the rusted metal floor. I grabbed the handle. It was heavy. It was heavy. I gasped, a sound of pure animal ecstasy. I dragged it toward me. It sloshed, a deep, heavy, beautiful slosh. God, I whispered. Thank you, God. I fumbled with the locking pin. My fingers were shaking so bad I couldn't grip it. I used my teeth, biting the metal pin and jerking my head back. It popped out. I threw the latch open. I lifted the heavy can. I tilted it. Liquid poured out. It hit my hand. It didn't feel cool. It felt oily. The smell hit me a split second later. It wasn't water. It was bitter, pungent, chemical, diesel. It was diesel fuel. Someone had put diesel in a water can, a common mistake, a fatal mistake. I stared at the oily puddle spreading on the truck bed, glistening with a rainbow sheen. I dropped the can. Clang, it fell on its side. The fuel glugged out, rhythmic and mocking. Glug, glug, glug. I watched it flow. I watched the fuel that could have driven a truck to safety, now useless, soaking into the wood and rust. I sat there in the back of the dead truck. The sun beat down. The driver grinned his leathery grin from the cab ahead. I laughed. I couldn't help it. It started as a giggle, bubbling up from the bottom of my lungs. Then it became a cackle, then a roar. I laughed until my ribs hurt, until I was wheezing, gasping for air that wasn't there. I laughed at the absurdity of the universe. I laughed at the lie of the white cross on the can. I laughed at Hannes. I laughed at myself. I was sitting on a drum of fuel in a desert, dying of thirst. I reached for my canteen. The real one. The one with 2 tablespoons of water left. I unscrewed the cap. I didn't save it. I didn't measure it. I tipped it back and drained it, every drop. It wasn't enough to quench the thirst. It just reminded my throat of what it was missing. I threw the empty canteen out of the truck. It bounced on the salt. Tink, tink. I picked up my rifle. I looked at the horizon. The north was still there. The sea was still there. Get up, Elias, I said. My voice was gone. It was just air. I slid off the truck. I landed in the salt mud. I looked at the dead driver one last time. Keep smiling, friend, I whispered. I turned my back on the graveyard. I started walking again, into the white, but now I had nothing. No water, no hope, just the walk. The walk was the only thing left. Here is Chapter 6. Chapter 6. The Ballroom of Ghosts. The salt ended. The world turned back to brown, but it was a cruel brown. It was the color of dried scab. I left the graveyard of trucks behind, but I carried the dead driver with me. His leathery grin was stamped on the inside of my eyelids. Every time I blinked, a slow, gritty shuddering of the eyes. I saw him. He was laughing at me. He knew the joke. The joke was that I was still walking. I had been without water for how long? The concept of hours had dissolved. There was only the sun position. It was high now, past the zenith, leaning toward the west. It felt angry. It felt like a physical weight on my shoulders, a heavy yoke of fire. My body was quitting. It wasn't a rebellion. It was a shutdown. The signals from my brain were getting lost on their way to my legs. I would command step, and my left leg would hesitate, trembling, before jerking forward a few inches. My tongue had swollen. It filled my mouth, a thick, dry sponge that tasted of copper and rot. I couldn't close my lips over it properly. I breathed through my nose, but the air was so hot it scorched my sinuses. I needed moisture. I looked at the ground. A small, round pebble, smooth and white, lay near my boot. I stopped. The process of bending down was a monumental engineering challenge. I had to lock my knees, hinge at the waist, and let gravity pull my torso down. The blood rushed to my head, thumping like a war drum. Boom, boom, boom. I reached out. My fingers were claws, stiff and uncooperative. I grasped the pebble. I stood up, swaying like a drunkard. I put the stone in my mouth. It was a trick I had learned from an old corporal in training. If you have no water, suck on a stone. It tricks the glands. It makes saliva. I rolled the hot stone around my mouth. It clicked against my teeth. Come on, I begged. Make the spit. Nothing happened. My glands were dead. Dried prunes. The stone just rattled against the dry tissue, scraping the roof of my mouth. There was no moisture left to give. I was a husk. I spat the stone out. It hit the dust. And then I heard the music. It wasn't the wind. It was distinct. A piano, a grand piano playing a waltz. Strauss, the Blue Danube. It was coming from the left, from behind a ridge of heat-shattered slate. I stopped. I knew, logically, that there were no pianos in the Tunisian desert. I knew this was the brain dying. I knew this was the neurons firing their final chaotic symphony before the lights went out. But it was so beautiful. I turned toward the music. "Is that you, Mother?" I rasped. No sound came out, just a puff of dry air. I shuffled toward the ridge. The waltz got louder. I could hear the clink of porcelain cups. I could hear the murmur of polite conversation. I rounded the rocks. There was no ballroom. There was no orchestra. There was a lizard. A spiny-tailed lizard, perhaps 30 centimeters long, sunning itself on a flat rock. It looked at me with beaded reptilian eyes. It didn't move. It didn't fear me. Why should it? I wasn't a predator anymore. I was part of the landscape. The music stopped. The silence rushed back in, louder than before. I stared at the lizard. "Meat," a voice whispered in my head. "Blood, wet blood." The thought was savage, primal. If I could catch it, if I could tear it open, there would be fluid inside. Life. I slowly unslung my rifle. The leather strap burned my neck. The Mauser felt like it weighed 50 kilos. My arms shook so violently the front sightpost danced in circles. The lizard watched me. It bobbed its head once, a mockery. I tried to aim. I couldn't align the sights. The barrel waved around, tracing wild arcs in the air. "Shoot," the voice commanded. I squeezed the trigger. Click. I'd forgotten to cycle the bolt after the last check. The metallic sound was sharp. The lizard vanished. It didn't run. It simply teleported into a crack in the rock. Gone. I stood there, the rifle pointed at the empty rock. I began to cry again, but without tears. Just a heaving of the chest, a dry convulsing of the diaphragm. I had failed even at being an animal. I lowered the rifle. I used it as a crutch to keep from falling. "I am sorry," I whispered to the rock. I turned back to the north, or what I hoped was north. The sun was in the west, so north was right? Left? Confusion swirled like smoke. I looked at the sun. If I put my left shoulder to it, yes, that was north. I walked. The hallucinations began to layer over reality. The scrub bushes turned into crouching men. "Halt!" I wanted to shout, but they were just bushes. The heat waves turned into water. I saw a lake, clear and cool, rippling in the distance. I knew it was a mirage. I walked toward it anyway. It receded, keeping its distance, taunting me. Then, the ground changed texture. The hard pan gave way to soft, drifting sand. This was the end. You cannot walk in soft sand when you are dying. It sucks the energy from your legs. It pulls you down. I took a step. My boot sank to the ankle. I had to lift my leg high to extract it. Lift, drag, sink. Lift, drag, sink. My heart was fluttering now. Not a steady beat, but a frantic vibration, like a moth trapped in a lantern. Flutter, flutter, stop. Flutter, flutter. I fell. It wasn't a dramatic collapse. My knees simply unhinged. I pitched forward, face first into the sand. The sand was hot, but not burning. It felt soft. It molded to my cheek. "Just stay here," the sand whispered. "It is soft. It is quiet. You have walked enough, Elias. You have walked enough for 2 lifetimes. I closed my eyes. The darkness was red and pulsing. It would be so easy. Just let the lungs stop. Let the heart flutter one last time and go still. The wind would cover me. In a year, I would be just like the bicycle man. Clean bones, a brass button. No. The word came from deep inside. Not from the brain, but from the gut. From the stubborn German refusal to yield. Not here, not in the dirt. I pushed with my hands. My arms were trembling straws. I lifted my chest 3 inches off the ground. I saw something, 10 meters away. Not a mirage, not a hallucination. A beetle, a black dung beetle, rolling a ball of camel dung across the sand. It was struggling. The ball was 3 times its size. It pushed, it slipped, it fell. It got up and pushed again. I watched it. If the beetle can move, I thought, then the man can move. I couldn't stand. Standing was impossible. The geometry of verticality was broken. I crawled. I dragged myself forward on my elbows, the rifle cradled in the crooks of my arms. I plowed a furrow through the sand. Inch, inch, inch. I followed the beetle. It was my general now. It knew the way. The sun touched the horizon. The sky turned the color of a bruised plum. The heat began to bleed away, replaced by the creeping chill. I crawled until the skin was flayed from my elbows. I crawled until the darkness was absolute. I stopped. The beetle was gone. Lost in the night, I rolled onto my back. The stars were back, the cold eyes of the universe, Orion, the hunter. He looked down at me, his belt shining bright. "I'm still here," I wheezed at him. "You haven't got me yet." My hand fell to my side. It touched something hard, not sand, not rock, metal, cold, smooth, cylindrical metal. I froze. My fingers traced the object, a rim, a seam. It was half buried in the sand. I dug at it, frantic, throwing sand aside with weak, desperate swipes. I pulled it free. It was a tin, a ration tin. I shook it. Thump, thump. It was full. I held it up to the starlight. I couldn't read the label. It was too dark. But I knew the shape. It was a standard Wehrmacht meat tin, Fleischkonserve. It must have fallen from a truck, maybe weeks ago, maybe during the retreat. I fumbled for my bayonet. My hands were useless paws. I couldn't get the scabbard unclipped. I grabbed the tin with both hands and smashed it against a rock. Clang. Again. Clang. The metal dented. It didn't break. I screamed, a silent, airless scream of frustration. I smashed it again, putting every ounce of remaining strength into the blow. Crack, a seam split, a dark, oily liquid oozed out. The smell hit me. It wasn't meat, it wasn't beef, it was peaches, sweet, syrupy, canned peaches. I didn't use a spoon. I didn't open it further. I pressed my mouth to the jagged, sharp crack in the metal. The tin cut my lip. I didn't feel it. I sucked. The syrup hit my tongue like liquid gold. It was sugar. It was moisture. It was life. It exploded in my mouth, shocking my withered glands. I drank the syrup until the tin was dry of liquid. Then, I used my finger to hook out the slices of fruit, shoving them into my mouth, chewing the soft flesh, swallowing them whole. I ate it all. In 30 seconds. I licked the inside of the tin until the sharp metal turned my tongue to ribbons. Then, I lay back on the sand. The sugar hit my blood like a drug. My heart steadied. The fog in my brain cleared, just a fraction. I was not saved. I was still lost. I was still miles from nowhere. But I had eaten a peach, and that meant the universe had made a mistake. It had given me a chance. I gripped the empty tin in my hand like a weapon. "Tomorrow," I whispered to the stars. "Tomorrow I walk out of this." I pulled the Zeltbahn around me. The cold was coming. But tonight, I had the taste of sugar on my lips. I closed my eyes. And for the first time in 3 days, I didn't dream of death. I dreamed of an orchard. Here is Chapter 7. Chapter 7. The Blue Edge of the World. I woke to the sensation of being eaten. It was a tickling, frantic movement on my chin, my lips, my cheek. I slapped my face, a clumsy, open-palmed strike that stung my sunburned skin. I pulled my hand away. It was covered in black specks, ants, thousands of them. They had found the syrup, the dried, sticky residue of the peaches, on my face, on my hands, on the jagged rim of the tin I still clutched in my sleep. They were harvesting me. I sat up, thrashing, wiping the insects from my skin. I didn't kill them. I didn't have the energy to hate them. They were just doing what the desert does, reclaiming the organic matter. I looked at the tin. It was swarming with them, a black living liquid moving over the silver metal. I dropped it. It hit the sand with a dull thud. I stared at it. That tin had saved my life, and now it belonged to the ants. I felt a pang of loss so sharp it almost doubled me over. It was my cup, my grail, and I had to leave it behind. "Goodbye," I croaked. I stood up. The sugar from the night before had done its work. The dizziness was still there, a constant gyroscope spinning in my skull, but the paralysis was gone. My muscles felt less like wood and more like rubber, weak, trembling, but functional. I looked north. The air had changed. For 3 days, the air had been a dry, scorching solid. Now, there was a moisture in it, a heaviness. It didn't cool the skin, it made the sweat cling, but it carried a scent. I sniffed, flaring my nostrils like a dog. Underneath the smell of hot sand and my own unwashed body, there was something else, sharp, briny, the smell of iodine and rotting kelp, the sea. It was a smell from another life, a smell of Hamburg harbor, of gulls screaming over the Elbe. I began to walk. The terrain changed again. The soft sand hardened into a crusty, salt-rimed soil, dotted with tough gray shrubs that looked like bundles of barbed wire. The ground rose steadily. A long, sloping incline leading to a ridge of white limestone that looked like the spine of a buried dragon. I climbed. The rifle was part of my skeleton now. I didn't feel its weight, I just felt the bruise it had permanently etched into my shoulder. 1 step, breathe, taste the salt. 2 steps, breathe, ignore the sun. The sun was behind me now, pushing me forward. It was April, but the African sun knows no calendar. It hammered the back of my neck, seeking the gap between my helmet and my collar. I reached the base of the ridge. It was steep, a scramble of loose rock. I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. If I stopped, the machinery would seize. I clawed my way up. My fingernails tore on the stone. My boots slipped, sending cascades of gravel rattling down the slope. I panted, a shallow, wheezing sound. I grabbed a jagged outcrop of rock and pulled. My muscles screamed. I hauled myself over the lip of the ridge. I lay there for a moment, face in the dirt, waiting for my heart to stop trying to punch through my ribs. Then I lifted my head, and the world ended. Below me, perhaps 2 kilometers away, the land simply stopped. It fell away into a jagged coastline of cliffs and dunes, and beyond that, blue. An impossible, endless, violent blue. The Mediterranean. It stretched to the horizon, a flat sheet of hammered turquoise, capped with white foam where the waves smashed against the rocks. I stared at it. I didn't smile. I didn't cheer. I felt a crushing, profound disappointment. The sea was not salvation. It was a wall. I had walked north to find the unit, to find the lines, but there were no lines here, just the water. If the Africa Corps had retreated, they had gone up the coast road, miles to the west or east. I had walked into a cul-de-sac. I was trapped between the hammer of the desert and the anvil of the deep. I watched the waves roll in. Even from this distance, I could hear them. A low, rhythmic hiss boom. The heartbeat of the planet. Water, I whispered. So much water, and none of it to drink. 1 billion gallons of poison. I scanned the coastline. To my left, the cliffs rose high and sheer. To my right, the land sloped down into a small crescent-shaped cove, a forgotten inlet where the sand was white and the water was calm. And there, winding through the dunes behind the beach, was a scar on the earth, a track, 2 ruts in the hardpan, faded but distinct. A road. My eyes followed the track. It wound from the west, dipped toward the cove, and then disappeared behind a headland to the east. It was empty. I watched it. I counted to 60, then to 100. Nothing moved. No dust cloud. No glint of windshields. But it was a road. A road meant men. Men meant water. I had to get down there. I stood up on the ridge, silhouetted against the sky. A perfect target. I didn't care. Let them shoot. At least the bullet would be quick. I began the descent. It was easier than the climb, but more dangerous. My legs were shaky, and gravity wanted to throw me down the slope. I slid, half skiing on the loose scree, braking with the butt of my rifle. I reached the bottom. The air here was thick with salt spray. It coated my lips. I licked them. The taste was intense, pure brine. It made my thirst flare up, a sudden burning demand. I stumbled toward the track. When I reached the ruts, I fell to my knees. I touched the tire marks. They were hard, old. The wind had already begun to fill them with sand. These tracks weren't made today, maybe not even this week. I sat in the middle of the road. I looked east, empty. I looked west, empty. I was the only living thing in the photograph. Then I saw it, down by the water's edge, half buried in the dune grass near the cove. A structure, not a truck, not a tent, a building, a small square hut made of white stone, a fisherman's shack, a storage shed. The roof was partially caved in, but the walls stood, and next to it, a shape covered in a tarp. I blinked, trying to clear the salt from my lashes. The shape was angular, boxy. I forced myself up. I left the road. I walked through the dune grass. The blades were sharp. They whipped at my shins. I got closer. The hut was old. The plaster was peeling, revealing the rough stone beneath. The door hung off one hinge, creaking in the sea breeze. All. But I ignored the hut. I looked at the tarp. It was canvas, bleached almost white by the sun, but I could see the original olive drab color in the folds. It was staked down with rocks. I walked up to it. My hand trembled as I reached out. The canvas felt hot and coarse. I grabbed the corner and pulled. The tarp slid off with a heavy rustle. Underneath was a motorcycle, a Zundap KS 750, a German sidecar combination. It was beautiful. It was a machine of war, heavy, industrial, painted in desert yellow. The tires were flat, the rubber cracked and spread like pancakes on the sand. The engine block was covered in a layer of fine dust. But it was German. It was mine. I ran my hand over the fuel tank. It was hot. I unscrewed the gas cap. I peered inside. Dry. A red stench of old varnish. Of course, I looked at the sidecar. It was filled with sand. But tucked under the spare tire mount, there was a metal box, an ammunition crate. I tried the latch, rusted shut. I took my bayonet. I jammed the blade into the gap and twisted. Creak, snap. The lid flew open. I looked inside. My knees gave way. I sat down heavily in the sand, staring into the box. It wasn't ammo. It was a bottle of wine. A dark green bottle, the label scratched off, and next to it, a tin of sardines and a folded piece of paper. I reached for the bottle. It was corked. I held it up to the sun. A dark red liquid swirled inside. Wine, not water, but liquid. I looked at the paper. I unfolded it. The paper was brittle, yellowed. It was written in pencil. The handwriting was jagged, hurried. Motor kaputt, kein Benzin. Wir gehen zu Fuß nach Osten. Wenn du das findest, trink auf uns. Geh for Miller. Engine broken. No gas. We are walking east. If you find this, have a drink on us. Lance Corporal Muller. I looked at the date scrawled at the bottom. 14. March, 1943, March 14th. It was now late April. They had been gone for a month. I looked at the bottle. I looked at the vast, indifferent sea. I was sitting by a dead machine, drinking the wine of dead men, in a cove that history had forgotten. I gripped the neck of the bottle. I didn't have a corkscrew. I smashed the neck against the engine block of the motorcycle. Crash. Glass flew. The top of the bottle sheared off jaggedly. Wine foamed up, red as arterial blood, spilling over my hand. I didn't wait. I didn't toast Corporal Muller. I lifted the broken glass to my lips, ignoring the sharp edges, and I drank. The wine was warm. It was sour. It tasted of vinegar and sun. But it went down. It burned my throat. It hit my empty stomach like a fist. I drank until I choked, coughing red spray onto the white sand. I lowered the bottle. I gasped. The alcohol hit my brain almost instantly. The edges of my vision softened. The roar of the sea became a lullaby. I leaned back against the wheel of the dead Zundap. I was drunk. I was dying, and I was at the beach. I closed my eyes and let the sun burn my face, and then, through the sound of the waves, I heard it, the sound of an engine, not a motorcycle, not a truck, a low, throbbing hum coming from the sea. I opened my eyes. I looked out at the water. Rounding the headland, cutting through the blue water, was a gray shape. A boat. A British motor torpedo boat. It was patrolling the coast. It was perhaps 500 meters out, and on its bow, the Union Jack snapped in the wind. I sat there, the broken wine bottle in my hand, the German rifle across my lap. I had a choice. Here is the final chapter. Chapter 8. Chapter 8. The White Flag of Bone. The boat was a gray shark. It cut through the turquoise water, pushing a V-shaped wake of white foam that looked like a scar healing in real time. I watched it through the bottom of the broken wine bottle. The green glass distorted the world, twisting the horizon, making the British flag look like a melting bruise. Thrum, 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 thrum. The sound of the engines was low and guttural. It wasn't the high-pitched whine of an aircraft, it was a deep, wet heartbeat. It vibrated in the sand under my heels. I sat there, paralyzed by the paradox. That boat was the enemy. It was the thing I had been trained to kill. It was the thing that had bombed our supply columns, that had strafed our positions. The men on that boat wanted me dead. But that boat was also water. I looked at the Mauser rifle lying across my lap. The wood was hot, the metal action bleached white by the salt spray. I touched the bolt handle. It felt familiar, like the hand of an old friend. Shoot, the soldier in my brain whispered. Take aim. One shot for Hannes, for the fatherland. I lifted the rifle. It weighed 1,000 tons. The barrel wavered, tracing figure eights in the air. I peered through the sights. The front post hovered over the gray shape of the boat. I could see figures on the deck now, tiny men in khaki shorts. One of them was standing behind a machine gun mount, a twin Vickers. The barrels were black eyes staring back at me. If I fired, I would miss. And then they would turn that machine gun on the beach, and I would be turned into pink mist and sand. I lowered the rifle. I looked at the wine bottle. I took another swig. The sour vinegar burned my throat, but the alcohol was already doing its work. It had numbed the fear. It had turned the terror into a strange, detached curiosity. "Hey!" I shouted. The word fell out of my mouth, clumsy and small. The wind took it and threw it away. They were passing. They were going to sail past the cove, round the next headland, and vanish. I would be left alone with the dead motorcycle and the ants. Panic, cold and absolute, pierced the drunken haze. I stood up. I swayed violently. The world spun. Blue sky, white sand, gray boat, a kaleidoscope of failure. I dropped the wine bottle. It didn't break. It just thudded into the soft dune. I waved my arms. "Here!" I screamed. My voice cracked, tearing the lining of my throat. "German! Higher! Help!" I stumbled down the dune, sliding in the loose sand, crashing through the sharp grass. I reached the water's edge. The waves lapped at my boots, soaking the leather. "Look at me!" I roared. "I am here!" The boat didn't turn. The wake continued to widen. I fell to my knees in the surf. The water soaked my trousers. It was cool. I cupped my hands and splashed the seawater onto my face. It stung my eyes. I tasted the salt on my lips. I was invisible. I was a ghost. Then the engine pitch changed. Gurgle, gurgle, roar. The gray shark slowed. Its bow dipped. It began to turn. A wide, sweeping arc. The white wake curved. They were coming about. They had seen me. Terror replaced the panic. They were coming. The enemy was coming. I looked back at the dunes. My rifle lay in the sand 20 meters away. I was unarmed. I was defenseless. I stood up, water dripping from my tunic. I raised my hands. I held them high, fingers splayed, the universal gesture. I have nothing. I am nothing. The boat drifted closer. The engines idled, a low, bubbling rumble. It stopped 50 meters out. I could see their faces now. They were sun-reddened. They wore peaked caps and naval insignia. The man on the Vickers gun tracked me. The barrels didn't waver. A man on the bridge picked up a megaphone. "Stay where you are." The voice was metallic, amplified, speaking English. "Hands on your head." I understood the tone, if not every word. I clasped my hands on top of my helmet. The metal was hot enough to burn my palms. A smaller dinghy was lowered from the side. 2 men got in. One was rowing. The other held a Thompson submachine gun. I watched them row toward me. The oars dipped in the water. Splash, creak, splash. I felt a strange sensation in my chest. It wasn't relief. It wasn't shame. It was an emptying. The vessel of my life, the soldier I had been, was being poured out into the sand. The dinghy scraped onto the beach. The man with the Tommy gun stepped out. He was tall, with a thick mustache and eyes the color of the sea. He pointed the gun at my chest. "Move and I'll cut you in half, Jerry," he said. I didn't move. I swayed. He walked up to me. He smelled of engine oil and tobacco. He kicked my legs apart, searching me. His hands were rough. He patted my pockets, my belt. He found the empty bayonet scabbard. He found the matchbox. "Clean," he shouted back to the boat. He looked at me. He looked at my cracked lips, my sunken eyes, the salt crust on my skin. He looked at the vomit on my tunic. He lowered the gun. "Jesus," he muttered. You look like hammered shit, mate. He reached to his belt. He unclipped a canteen. My eyes locked onto it. I couldn't stop them. I made a sound, a whimpering animal noise. He unscrewed the cap. He held it out. Easy now, he said. Don't choke. I grabbed the canteen. My hands were shaking so hard, I spilled it down my chin. The water was cool. It was sweet. It was not diesel. It was not wine. It was pure, distilled life. I drank. I drank until he pulled it away. That's enough, he said firmly. You'll kill yourself. I gasped, air rushing into my wet throat. I looked at him. Danke, I whispered. He didn't smile. He just nodded. Come on. War's over for you, Fritz. He gestured to the dinghy. I turned around. I looked at the beach one last time. I saw the dead motorcycle. I saw the broken wine bottle. I saw the track leading back into the burning interior of the continent. I saw the footprints I had made coming down the dune. The wind was already erasing them. In an hour, they would be gone. I had walked out of the furnace, but I had left Elias Völker back there, somewhere between the salt pan and the lizard rock. The man getting into the boat was someone else, a prisoner, a survivor, a ghost in a gray uniform. I climbed into the dinghy. I sat on the wooden bench. The sailor pushed us off. The sand grated against the keel one last time. Scrape. We moved out into the blue. I looked at the water passing beneath the hull. It was deep and clear. I closed my eyes. I listened to the sound of the oars. Creak, splash, creak, splash. It was the sound of a clock. The clock had started again. I was alive. God help me. Epilogue. Obergrenadier. Elias Völker spent the remainder of the war in a POW camp in Texas. He returned to Germany in 1947. He never spoke of the desert, but every night, until the day he died in 1988, he would keep a glass of water on his bedside table, full to the brim.